I'm a black mother. I have 3 black sons. Will the police brutality and the racism, will it ever stop?
Tonight, a question involving race and policing.
The police need to start policing the police.
Collective bargaining agreements actually, and state laws actually protect the bad officers.
And I would ask him, would you trust these people to protect your family?
A new poll tapping into the minds of voters in the midst of a movement for change. What the latest Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll is revealing, and an in-depth conversation with our community.
It's been going on for a lot of years. Now's the time for it to stop.
Plus, your questions answered by the people who lead our community.
I'm the mayor of the city. I take responsibility for this city. If at the end of the year we have not moved the needle on the racial divide and the police reform that we have to accomplish, then that's on my shoulders.
The latest results of the Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll are in. One of the biggest issues facing not only us here in South Texas, but across the nation, the issue of race as it intersects with policing. People were calling for reforms, relationships with police throughout our entire community, throughout many different sectors of our community. This poll is talking about how South Texas, how San Antonians feel about those issues.
And through the next probably hour and a half at least, we're going to discuss a lot of those issues. We're going to get to a lot of things. But first, we want to go through some of the poll results, some of the major themes in this poll when it comes to race and policing. And we are joined by our first panelists tonight. 2 of them are from the Bexar Facts team, and one of them is from the Rivard Report team. Graham Watson-Ringo is the managing editor of the Rivard Report. Lisa Baratachea is with Bexar Facts, along with DeMonte Alexander. And of course, our own Isis Romero will be joining us a little bit later and into the town hall that we will carry online as well. I know all 3 of you have seen these poll results. And Graham, I want to start with you first. What's your major takeaway from what you saw and what South Texas is telling us?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway for me has been the division in terms of politics. It's very partisan, looking at some of these questions and seeing how Democrats react one way and Republicans react the other. And I think it's interesting to see how drastic the difference is, especially as it pertains to the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, Lisa, your takeaway from what you read in this poll.
Probably the things that stand out the most to me. One is how in our last poll in April and in this poll, both times the communities overwhelmingly said that they were worried that we were going to end our social distancing too soon, which has really come to fruition. And then also the idea of the kind of a higher level, that one of the ideas is that people of color, I identify with that, Black people identify with that, and how different, so consistently different, the data shows how African Americans and Hispanic people have different opinions. So that was something that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, a big thing out of all this is I think we need to listen to each other and we need to hear our stories. And I think also, certainly as a news organization and a polling organization, we need to be careful about just saying people of color and thinking that that's all in one bucket. DeMonte, your takeaway.
Yeah, and I'll elaborate that on later, and just thank you guys for the platform. But what stood out for me, Steve, and I was happy to see, is that this community feels that the police union needs complete reform, complete overhaul. And I was happy to see that. And that was a big takeaway for me. And also approval for the CARES Act funding. Obviously, our community has took a big hit in terms of our budget. So that CARES Act funding is going to be desperately needed, needs to be implemented correctly. So happy to see the community supports that overwhelmingly. And also the concerns for COVID-19. If you see when people said that they felt like the social distancing will end too soon. And obviously we're seeing what's happening, right? We opened too soon. Now we're seeing a spike. And so I'm happy to see our data was right on that. But those are the things that stood out to me.
Let's take a look at what some of the biggest concerns for people who took part of this poll are. And this is always interesting to me in this poll because this is an open-ended question. These are not selections that were put forth for them to choose from. Of course, COVID-19 right there at the top with the majority of people saying they're concerned about it, crime and security tying with that one. But I also want to take a look at police/police actions showing up in this poll, and then racism being an issue that is just outside of the top 10. And this is something that people view as the most serious problem respondents want local government to address. So I think that's something that we should touch on.
Yeah, and I think we will. It's an interesting perspective of the racism and, like you said, police and civil unrest showing up, and we're going to ask our panel about that very question coming up after the break.
I think we need to have... We are back with the latest results of the latest Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll, and I want to get to that question we talked about just before the break. The fact that racism is appearing and police actions and racism are part of what respondents here believe are some of the most serious problems facing San Antonio that they would like local government to address. Lisa, I'd like to pose this question to you, given your background in public policy. These are complicated issues, and I find it interesting that these are ones people are looking to local leaders, local elected officials to actually do something about.
I mean, at the end of the day, leadership is leadership, right? And I think that the way that our community leaders have been responsive, I think that our polling numbers have shown that our community is responding to them. The numbers for the mayor, the judge, the police chief polled 77%. It was the highest. He was the highest rated public official in our latest poll. Unfortunately, we hadn't polled him before, but he's by far the most popular of the ones we polled, and that's significant. I mean, he didn't get those numbers by without a lot of work. And I think that the community is supportive of him. They are supportive of the fact that he's tried to do the right thing consistently. And he's been a spokesperson for the community and been engaged in local conversations. I think that shows that in that 77%.
I want to move on to the question about the police union specifically, because there's been a lot of accusations by the police chief himself saying that police unions protect bad officers. And here you get an idea of what the poll shows. The question: police unions have been a barrier to holding local police officers accountable for misconduct. 68% agree, 20% disagree, 12% not sure. Local police are fair and impartial when enforcing the law. 69% agree in this case. But when we look at the union and we look at the impartiality of officers, this kind of shows the fact, like I said off the top, people are supportive of police, but they are also supportive of police reform. DeMonte, you brought up the fact about the police union. What do you take from this?
Look, this is an old war, man. But looking at the data and the overall support for reform across the board, I feel it's a new day, right? There needs to be standards and lines drawn in the sand with what the union will or will not protect and allow, right? For the life of me, I cannot believe that, you know, even with an institution like that, that you would have an officer that is blatantly violating the law, feeding feces sandwiches to people. I mean, that's ridiculous, right? And for you as a union not to have a standard, even within your own institution, to say, look, that's too far, I can't protect you, but to gloss that over, right? And that's ridiculous. And it's obvious that the reform needs to be had.
What does it say to the community? What does it say to the community as a whole that something like that can go on, and there be no punishment, there be no real, solid, tangible punishment? I mean, it's almost like a relationship of, you know, they can get away with whatever they want, but you're going to be held to a higher standard, when it should be the police that are held to the higher standard.
Yeah. So do you support what? I mean, are you encouraged by what you've seen in this poll? It seems like people are paying attention to that.
Definitely, and I'm glad it's coming to light. I think it started to come to light a little bit during the fire union negotiations, because we kept comparing the two and talking about it. And I know Cheryl Scully had a hand in really bringing it back out into the forefront and talking about the police union and some of the things that are wrong with that contract. And I think now, considering what's been going on nationally, I think everybody is looking at their police union contracts, and San Antonio's is pretty glaring in terms of almost, I wouldn't say rewarding, but definitely not punishing bad officers.
Well, let's be clear here. There's officers on the force today that should be fired. Mm-hmm. I mean, let's just put it out there, right? Willful ignorance. You know, some people are just not ready to face the ugly truth of what's happening in this community in terms of racism. But, you know, I know you talked about optimism, Steve. You know, what makes me optimistic about all of this is that there are other people besides myself, Graham, and Lisa are screaming Black Lives Matter. You have little white girls, little white boys out here saying, Mom, Black Lives Matter. That's important. That's what keeps me optimistic, is that we're not screaming in the dark. We're not screaming all by ourselves that there's a problem.
There's a lot more to this conversation. Interesting to see how all of these thoughts and these responses play into that next contract with the city and the police union, which is coming up next year, which will be, negotiations will begin then. We'll continue this conversation after the break.
All right, so this next question that we're going to get into, Adrian, can you hear me in the booth?
As we continue this conversation about the results of the latest Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll, specifically focused on race and policing, an important point to address in this poll, the question about too many local police are biased against African Americans. All voters, 36%, agreed with that statement, but we have it broken out by different groups here.
And this is something that we talked about, Lisa, DeMonte, and Graham. When we break it out by race, ethnicity, you can see that 32% of whites agree with that too many local police are biased against African Americans. 36% of Latinos agree with that. 65% of African Americans agree with that. And so that's why I think we have to be very careful when we use the term people of color and kind of lump them all together. Graham, talk about this and what this shows you here.
Well, I think this is reflective of experience, history, generational storytelling. I mean, it's ingrained in African American culture to hear these stories passed down of you either know somebody who's been racially targeted by police, you have somebody in your family who has been, or you have been, and it's almost too common within our community. And so I think there's an inherent feeling that the police have a bias against us because of the experiences either we've had or we've heard about or have been passed down to us through different experiences of other people within our family. And so I think that comes through here. That's not saying that that is not happening in San Antonio, but I think that's ingrained in African American people, because I think it would be hard to find somebody who hasn't had a moment where they felt that implicit bias. And so a lot of other cultures, a lot of other races don't have that in them. And I think that's a lot of what that stems from.
Yeah, Lisa, do you agree on this? I mean, you and I talked about this on the phone a while back about the disparity between how Latinos and African Americans feel about police and policing.
I mean, I just think it's so interesting that the numbers from Hispanic and white are so close, 32% and 36% for Hispanic, and just how different it is for the Black response, 65%, almost double, right? I think that, when you circle back around, at the end of the day, even if you are a minority or of color, when you're of color in America, is not the same as being Black in America. And I think that in the conversation about, Black Lives Matter, I think that just highlights the fact that it's different. It's not the same as just a racial everybody of color. That it is this time in this movement that we need to recognize that there's something going on, that there's been something going on. And this reinforces, our numbers reinforce that there is a disparity there. For the African American number to be so different than the others is reflective of what's the conversation and the need to have a conversation specifically about Black Lives Mattering.
Yeah, and I think if Steve, you don't mind, I want to talk about that as well, because I think it's important. The top line results, they actually didn't surprise me. This is how most Black people feel every day. Like, we don't need a poll to tell us that police are biased against us, or even white folks, right? That's out there, right? And I mean, the entire premise of us even asking this question, it highlights that, right? So we don't have to guess if there's bias. We feel it every day. What did surprise me, to Lisa's point, is the number of Hispanic voters who share the same opinion as white men, while often being categorized together as people of color with us. That was very, very staggering to me.
All right.
Yeah, we had a conversation, but when we were drafting the poll, like, is this conversation, is it bias against people of color, or is it bias against African Americans? And so we made a deliberate distinction to highlight African American, and it's a good thing we did.
Yeah, it's educational, absolutely.
More to come on this breakdown just after the break.
Here, you got me? Okay. I don't think we have enough time. I think we're done with the 6 o'clock, guys. Like, I think we're out of time.
Okay.
Like we went over in that last discussion. So I will plug,
sorry.
That's all right. I will plug the, obviously the survey and the.
Take the survey online.
Yeah, and early voting and all that good stuff. Definitely.
Early voting starts Monday the 29th. Election day is the 14th.
Monday.
July the 14th.
Next Monday, early voting starts. July 14th is the election day, correct?
For the
Yes.
runoff, yes.
Yep. All right. I appreciate it, guys. I didn't want to interrupt that conversation. I'm going to be honest with you. I let it go longer. They were telling me go to break, go to break, go to break. But you guys were so good going back and forth that I didn't want to interrupt it. So I let it go.
Okay.
So it's on
Thank
me.
you, Steve.
I'll take the blame for it.
No problem.
Thank you.
You can blame
guys.
me, Dave. Everyone does anyway.
All right. Thank you,
Yeah,
Steve.
I know. I got wide shoulders, so I'm good. All right, thank you guys. I appreciate it. Graham, I really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back on again as a guest if you're okay with that.
Yeah, of course. That'd be great.
All right, thank you guys.
All
Hey, Graham, tell your husband I enjoyed his piece.
Oh, thank you very much.
It's awesome.
I appreciate that. Okay.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
It was low, so I turned it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I can barely hear everybody. So we haven't started yet, right? I just want to make sure I have the pronunciation of, I don't know if it's Kimia or Kimia?
Camilla, I think. Yeah. Well, I think we're going to find out.
Okay. I want to ask her and make sure that.
Do we have our next panel? Yes, I'm bringing them in right now. All right.
We're not touching the graphics at this point.
What?
We're not touching the graphics. We're just bringing them in as
Correct. This is the conversation part. We're
Yeah,
not really going
I do.
over the poll.
I do kind of want their reaction. Well, I don't know. I think we're good.
Hi, can you hear us? Hello, 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 hello. Mic check, mic check. Hi, can you hear us? Is it?
It's pronounced Kimia.
Yes.
Camilla, can you hear me? Do we have our next panel? Right.
So say that one more time. It's Camilla. Camilla, correct?
I think she has her. I think she's watching the live stream, and she can't hear us.
Make sure we rectify that.
Yes, I do. I do.
She can't hear us.
Well, I don't know. I think we're good.
Hello, hello, hello.
So she's watching it on a delay.
Can you hear us?
Okay, Camilla, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was worried we were on a delay there, so thank you for joining us. Dr. Hudspeth, can you hear me?
I can.
All right,
Perfect.
awesome. Thank you.
And then Aranetta, we are waiting on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, I don't like to assume things, but I'm guessing that you guys have at least looked at the poll and watched the town hall about what we've discussed so far.
Well, we have. I was watching it a few moments ago. Just turn the TV off.
Okay, great.
What's the poll? What are the polls saying?
It's kind of a dichotomy, Camilla, between people support the police, but they also support police reform, if that makes any sense at all in this whole thing. But what I want to do with this portion, what ECs and I are going to try to do with this portion is, this is going to be more community-led, like community questions. And we have our poll that we can lean back on if we need to, but I'm more curious about what the community concerns are and what you guys are hearing and what you guys would like to see and where we are historically, and, you know, if that makes sense.
It does indeed.
The videos are all at the bottom. Can we tilt it down just a little bit? Aranetta?
Is Aranetta with us? Aranetta?
It's a girl.
Is Aranetta with us? I don't think we have Araneta. Do we have Araneta with us? I don't think we do.
Have a cell phone number.
Okay. All right, Steve, you guys ready for this part?
Yep.
All right.
Hold on one second, though. It was a Monday in May that reignited a call for change.
What do you want? I can breathe.
3 words: I can't breathe. Heard around the world.
Say his name! George Floyd! Say his name! George Floyd!
That first call to action that we had for George Floyd really gained a lot of traction because I think that the climate that we're living in right now has really gotten a lot of people's attention.
And we begin with late-breaking news from the city of San Antonio tonight.
Steve, Ursula, this is a 7th day of protest here in San Antonio. Just take a look. We have a pretty good-sized crowd out here.
So I was just going to say, despite the hot temperatures, I want you to just take a look behind me. Hundreds of people showed up from all different walks of life.
Marches stretching for weeks in San Antonio with a demand to be heard.
This should not just be something because it's trending or because it's a hashtag. Black Lives Matter. They have always mattered and they will continue to matter.
Tonight, a deeper conversation right here in San Antonio. Welcome to our continuation of this town hall. The Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll was revealed today, joined by Isis Romero. And what we'd like to do for the next however long we have together, at least an hour, is have a community-driven conversation. We've seen what the poll results are among the 600 and some likely voters, but what does the community have to say about this historic moment at the intersection of race and policing?
Yeah, and at the end of it all, we hope that this conversation is insightful. We hope that everyone will learn something. And at the end of the day, we really hope that this will help spark some change in our community. We are pleased to be joined by a couple of panelists. I want to introduce you to them now. We'll begin with Camilla Factory. She is a local activist. She helped organize the May 30th protests here in San Antonio after the killing of George Floyd. And also Dr. Gregory Hudspeth. He is president of the San Antonio branch of the NAACP. Thank you both so much for joining us. We will also hope to be joined by Araneta Pierce. Hopefully she'll be joining us a little bit later in this broadcast.
Yeah. Camilla, can I start with you tonight? What do you want our viewers to know about your efforts, about, what you're calling for?
Well, I think it's simple. I want for the cases of Charles Roundtree, Anthony Scott, and Marquise Jones to be reopened and reinvestigated. Joe Gonzalez told the media that he had no intentions of securing the case, or reopening the case. I mean, I feel like that's quite negligent considering the fact that there is a legal loophole in the 13th Amendment. If there is a legal loophole in the 13th Amendment that allows Black folk to be massively incarcerated, I think that we can find a loophole in these cases. And I think that the families also deserve reparations. I also would like to call for the bare minimum. what is that? The city council also stated that they did not want to put on the agenda the removal of the Christopher Columbus statue and the renaming of Christopher Columbus for Thursday's city council meeting. And I find that to be very disappointing because I feel like that is the bare minimum that the city can do for its citizens, simply because Christopher Columbus is known for mass genocide for indigenous folk. And he's also known for colonization efforts in the United States that, led to slavery for Black folk. So those are just the heavily weighing concerns that I have for the community of San Antonio. And I believe simple demands that the city can answer for the people.
We should also note that we do anticipate Mayor Ron Nirenberg, Police Chief William Mcmanus, and as you mentioned, the District Attorney Joe Gonzalez to join us a little bit later to answer some of those questions. Dr. Hudspeth, I want to ask my next question to you. We recognize there's a problem on the national level. Talk to us about the problem here locally. San Antonio is a very diverse community, but talk to us about the problem of racism here in the San Antonio area.
Racism has been a problem here in San Antonio for many years. And whereas I listened to some of the discussion that's taken place, and I've heard police officers or the police union suggest that we are, not just here in San Antonio, but that we're becoming an anti-police nation, if you will. And there couldn't be anything that's further from the truth. Most police officers are good people, and so we have no problems with police officers in general. What we do have a major problem with are bad police officers. And there are a number of bad police officers here in San Antonio. And so our real problem is that the police union here in San Antonio, as well as other police unions, have protected those bad police officers. And they protect them through the contract. Whereas a bad police officer, we have one here in San Antonio that was making an arrest at River Center Mall. And in making that arrest, he used racial slurs. And the decision was made to fire him. And so he was fired. However, because of the police union's contract and through arbitration, he was able to get his job back. And so here we know we have a police officer in San Antonio that has explicit racial biases and has used racial slurs as he makes an arrest. And then we put him back on the streets and we put a gun on his hip and put him in a police car and tell him to go out and protect people. Well, we know that he's not going to protect all of us with the same sense of protection that he should give to protect and serve in this community. So we know that. So here you have someone and one individual that we can speak very directly about that we know it's not going to serve, does not serve the city of San Antonio well, and he's on the police force. And because of the police union's contract, he was permitted to get his job back and continue to be on the streets and put African Americans in jeopardy.
I think you pointed it out, but to go even further than to your point, I mean, this was an officer who was caught on camera, caught on body camera, saying this slur and still got his job back somehow through arbitration. Are you, talk about the moment we're at. I called it a historic moment. It feels like it's a historic moment, Dr. Hudspeth, but I don't want to put words in either one of your mouths. So do you think we're at a historic moment for this country?
Yeah, and let me just add, we've had African Americans to be choked before. We've had African Americans to be arrested and not treated fairly before. But in this particular case, with George Floyd, what we saw was a public lynching. And we saw a police officer with his knee on this man's throat. And even after his pulse was taken and he was non-responsive, he stayed there for almost 9 minutes. And so what we saw this time was an Emmett Till sort of moment, if you will, in which we can see it in history books and we can see it in documentaries, but this time we saw it on live TV, if you will. And so, it's not that George Floyd was the first one to experience this, but at some particular point, we find ourselves at that crossroad where enough is enough. And this enough is enough is not just coming from the African American community, but as we well know, it's come from this very integrated population in the United States, and we've extended it far beyond the United States. I saw demonstrations in England. I saw demonstrations in Paris. I saw demonstrations in all over the world because of what's happening in the United States. So when we as Americans, when we tell countries how they treat their citizens and how they should behave with regards to the treatment of their citizens, we really don't have a good leg to stand on when we have a segment of our population that we very clearly do not treat fairly. We very clearly do not treat them equally. We very clearly do not give them equal justice under the law. So what we have in this particular case is that we have that moment that occurred that changed things. And so George Floyd, 4 weeks ago, no one knew his name. And we know his name today because of what happened to him on TV. And I say on TV, what happened to him. And fortunately, we had a young lady that had a cell phone camera and she took pictures. Otherwise, we would not have heard the correct story. And so this is a moment in which this became visible for everyone to see what exactly had occurred.
I want to get to some of our community questions right now. That was a big part of this discussion, is to go out into the community, hear about some of the experiences, hear about some of the concerns that folks in the community have. I'm going to start with a question posed by Queen. Queen identifies as biracial. Queen says she has experienced racism in her life, and one of her main concerns is how racism will affect her children and then her grandchildren. Here's her question for the panel.
What's going to make a change? How are we going to change it? And how do we get past this to give a better future for everybody? Not just one race, one color, but everybody, because that's what San Antonio's mixed with here.
Camille, I'm going to let you answer that question. What's going to make it change?
Well, I think firstly, giving credence to the intersections of the African diaspora. I heard several times that we referred to Black folk as simply African Americans, when in fact, there is an entire African diaspora, whether it be African immigrants that have immigrated here from Africa post-colonization in the United States, or it be Afro-Latinas or Afro-Latinx folk. I think that we have to give credence to the various ranges of Blackness and how those are encompassed and policed upon the Black body in the United States. I also think that Blackness is beautiful and Blackness is the future, and it is the past and it is the present. And once we can understand that and have more honest conversations, not for votes, not for popularity, but for honest lives that are on the line, that walk the streets and that blood is shed on, I think that will get us further than we've gotten. But I agree with the president of the NAACP. This is the same fight that we have been fighting since the 60s and before. And so I really hope to see that for our children, for our children's children.
Do you think, Camilla, that those conversations are happening now?
I think that they are. I think this is the beginning. I think we're crawling and we're going to walk and then we will eventually run. But I think that I'd like to see more of these conversations happening. I don't think that George Floyd should have begged for his life for 10 minutes for a video to go viral for us to have these conversations. I think that Black folk have been suffering for far too long, and that this is the beginning and the bare minimum of these conversations.
Before we get to another community question, I want to touch on the topic of systemic racism, because there's, to me, very bold racism, very in-your-face kind of racism, and then there's racism that's a little bit harder to detect. And talk to me about systemic racism, this type of racism, and what would it take, in your opinion, to dismantle it? I'm going to pose the question to both of you.
I think one of the challenges we have is that systemic racism is based on a history of racism. And it's based on activities in which it simply becomes the way that business is done in given communities. If we look at, for instance, COVID-19, and we find that African Americans die of COVID-19 at a greater proportion than any other segment of our population. So the question becomes why? Well, because many of these African Americans that were dying of COVID-19 and who were contracting COVID-19 did not have the opportunity to have the appropriate medical care. And when they go to the doctors, they are not always seen and the way in which they are, I should not just say the doctors, but when they go into medical institutions, they are not always viewed as if they really matter. And so they don't always receive the same type of health care that other groups will receive. And so this creates a problem. And so when you tack COVID-19 to George Floyd and to the other cases, at this particular point, you say enough is enough. And so, COVID-19, I think, actually led, if you will, in many ways, to the issues that we find on the table today with regards to racism. And so it's there in our medical community, it's there in our education communities, it's there in our policing. When you have, I'll go back to the police officer again, when he used the N-word here in San Antonio as he was making that arrest. He didn't see anything wrong with what he had done. When you saw the officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck, he did not think he had done anything wrong. When you saw the shooting in Atlanta, the police officer truly did not think he had done anything wrong. That, I did what I'm supposed to do when there's an African American involved.
I want to add
I don't have to give him the same sort of respect.
Sure.
If I might chime in,
yes.
I want to give I want to go from what I feel like is a subtle expression of racism, so a microaggression, right? How Black African Americans are forced to tame our hair, or if we have dreadlocks or we have an afro, how that's deemed less professional. Those are called microaggressions that African Americans and Black folk face in professional settings, all the way down to a Christopher Columbus statue in a park named Christopher Columbus, who is known for the beginning of colonization and mass genocide. Racial undertones are vast, and they are everywhere. And so whether it be because of someone's hair, because of someone's skin color, or down to the very reason that a statue still stands in 2020 when Black folk are screaming on the streets for their lives, I think that this question can really be fixed to the African diaspora, if I must say.
All right, I want to add another voice here. I believe we have Aranetta Pierce with us, arts advocate, civic leader. She chaired the MLK Jr. Commission in 1987 when San Antonio and the commission held their first official MLK Jr. March. Aranetta, we are pleased to have you with us, and we've talked about where we are in history at the intersection of race and policing. We're talking about systemic racism right now, and the fact that if you say that to certain people, they flinch. EC's talked about systemic racism on TV in one of the questions she asked the other day, and had several emails, angry emails from people talking about how that doesn't exist. Okay, Aranetta, I think you're muted. Can you hit unmute on your screen there?
I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation. I'm a little older than the other participants, so maybe there'll be some wisdom from the ages. But I think that racism has been out of the box for a long time, and it is systemic in our community. And to say that it is a part of policing is just need to understand that it is a part of the total picture of American society. It is also important to go back to understand that when you have spent 400 years telling the world that Black people, African Americans, are inferior and that they are in some ways not human, 3/5 of a person, then it's going to take a lot of didactic work, that really intentional efforts in order to change the perception that people have of who we are, so that every institution, every organization understands who we are and what we need. I would recommend that every police department, every union, every American corporation, city government, every entity have a position on its staff for a diversity specialist or diversity vice president or someone with some authority, because we're going to have to change the perception of African Americans to other people in order to change it in any particular institution like policing.
Absolutely. I want to get to some more community questions just because we had so many come into our newsroom. I'm going to start with Andreen Hartman. When we met Andreen, she told us about a recent incident in which she had been racially profiled by police and talked about how this isn't the first time that this has happened to her. In fact, it's something that she says that she's dealt with time and time again. Here is Andreen's question for the panel.
I'm a black mother. I have 3 black sons. Will the police brutality and the racism, will it ever stop? Because black lives do matter.
Camilla,
powerful question.
Absolutely. And Camilla, I saw you shaking your head no. Why is that?
Because I can certainly relate to that question, and it's a very haunting truth for Black folk in America and worldwide, but certainly in America. And the sad truth is, we don't necessarily have an immediate answer to that today, but activists like myself and activists like the folk on the panel fight every single day to see that be a possibility for Black folk in this nation. And I see a lot of talk about people claiming that protesters are rioters and trying to paint peaceful protesters in a negative light. But I will say that, you can't really value the broken window of a business that has insurance to a broken body. Now, am I in a broken Black body? Now, am I in any way advocating for the vandalism of property? Absolutely not. But I think that we need to value Black folk on that level, and we need to weigh that question very heavily when moving forward in conversations of reform or abolition.
Dr. Hudspeth, your reaction when you heard that woman ask if her child will ever be free of the fear of being racially stereotyped?
I pray that it will occur, but probably not in my lifetime. And hopefully in her child's lifetime or her grandkids' lifetime that we can see this. My father was active with the civil rights movement, and I would suggest that he fought some battles that he was hoping that I would not have to fight. And so here we are, many years later, fighting those same battles. I think all of us who are African Americans can identify with incidents that have occurred in which we've been racially profiled. And that is being stopped by the police while you're driving and having not committed any offense, but having your ID checked and then being permitted to proceed. And even on one occasion, I had finished cutting the grass in my yard and was walking out of my garage, walking around to the front of my house. I lived on the corner at that time. And I could sense someone watching me as I was walking around. So I turned around and the police officer had pulled to the curb by my garage and was watching me as I walked out of the garage. And when we made eye-to-eye contact, he then pulled away and pulled up to my garage and looked into my driveway at my cars in my driveway, in my garage, just to make sure that I wasn't there to steal anything. And then he pulled off. I was being racially profiled at my house. And so those things will happen. And so it has happened so frequently that we know, and I could give you several other incidents. I'm not going to take all of the time tonight to talk about incidents at the Marriott River Center Mall that I encountered in which I was racially profiled. Someone walked up to me, I was waiting for my car, and someone walked up to me and gave me his ticket for me to go get his car. And so these sort of things happen all the time. So the question is, when will it stop? And my answer is, I don't know. But what I would suggest to you is we will continue to fight that battle and continue to make sure that our presence is known so that we can try to bring about the change. And what I saw with the George Floyd incident, with all of the people of all colors, of all ethnicities, of all the ages being out there walking the streets together and protesting, it gave me a great deal of hope that something will change soon.
You mentioned, Dr. Hudspeth, fighting the battle, and I want to ask you about being an ally. For those who want to be an ally, what does that take? What advice would you give to someone who may not identify as a person of color but still wants to help, who still wants to see change?
Because let's face it, this is a message that goes beyond any one particular race or ethnicity. I mean, for change to happen, it has to, correct?
Absolutely. And so what we ask, and we do this within the NAACP. Obviously, the NAACP is an organization that founded in 1909. So we are a very old organization, the oldest civil rights organization in the world. But I would hasten to point out that we were founded primarily by non-Black folks, by Jews and by Anglos and by other individuals other than individuals who look like me. Because even in 1909, they understood that there was a need to do something and to bring about a change. And so that's what, we're about doing. We're about trying, we're still working on it. There's still work to be done, but we're about trying to bring about that change. And so what we do then is that we invite everyone to join us. I would hasten to point out that we are neither Democrat nor Republican, but we do understand who our friends are. We do not have permanent friends, nor do we have permanent enemies. We have permanent issues. And so when someone comes across that line and says, let us join hands with you and work with you about bringing about a change, it doesn't make any difference who that person is, what that person looks like, which church the individual attends, how he worships his God. It doesn't make any difference. We're ready to lock arms together and work together. However, at that same time, if someone says, well, I was asked once, how long do we have to treat African Americans differently? And my response is, as long as they're treated differently, until we can treat African Americans just like we treat everyone else. So that when I walk into a store or I get into an elevator, I don't see people clutching their purses because I walked in. So as long as we have those type of things, we're going to continue to have the problem. But we're willing to work with anyone.
Aaronetta Pierce, I want to ask the same question to you. If there's somebody out there that wants to know, how can I help? What can I do? What would you tell them?
I would say to educate yourself. I would first like to say, though, to that mother, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I know how deflating that is. But again, Stephen, I think we have to go back and say, we're going to have to educate this world on not the myths of history, but the truth of history, that when we were enslaved, we were people who were treated inhumanely in so many ways, separated as families. And then we were freed, and then there was a separate but equal process, which was never, ever equal. So if you look at a community and people say, oh, look at them, they are lazy, they are dangerous, they are this, that, and the other, they need to understand that every time African Americans have tried to pick themselves up from separate but equal, from Brown to versus the Board of Education, from Jim Crow laws, from voting restrictions, from legal claims, things that were legally done, we have not been reinforced. And as a result, everybody who has had thoughts about us or dealing with us have had negative thoughts. These are the attitudes that we're going to have to change. We're going to have to say the communities that you see now are what you created, not what we wanted for ourselves. It's an understanding that African Americans have never been given across the board. Some African Americans have had opportunities because they either had a break or something serendipitous or some extreme dedication like my father had in his life. But by and large, the average African American has been put down. And as Maya Angelou says, African Americans have been put down so long and so successfully, they cease to try. And I think if we have more conversations like this, if we understand there's no magic wand that is going to change somebody's attitude about us without communication and understanding, that we want the same things that they want, like this mother who called in. We want our children to be safe. We want good education for them. We want lovely housing and parks and pretty flowers in the yard. We all want the same thing, We just need laws and support to do it. There are many ways people can help.
And Camilla, I want to give you the opportunity to answer that question as well. What does it take to be an ally, Camilla?
Now, I appreciate the opportunity. I believe that everyone has, within my voice, has to understand that there is something you can do. You can vote. You can encourage legislation that enhances the lives of Black people, whether it's educational opportunities, financial opportunities. You can contribute to the NAACP, and particularly the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And Bryant Stevenson, the young man who they made the movie about, Just Mercy, he is leading a project called the Justice Project. He needs money. He is trying to help incarcerated African Americans gain their freedom in so many ways that they were incarcerated unfairly. Businessmen can bring African American students into their companies as interns. It's just a plethora of as simple as, if you hear some pejorative comments being made about another group, say stop it. Say stop it. We're no longer doing that. We have to have some courage. And again, I live my life almost quoting my parents and Martin Luther King and Maya Angelou. But we need to read and understand. I cannot transmit with a magic wand understanding to others. They must speak it.
Miss Araneta?
Yes.
I believe she was asking me what I could.
Camilla, yeah, I appreciate what Miss Araneta was saying, as you said, and I appreciate those thoughts. But I do want to hear from you, Camilla. How, in your view, can someone be an ally?
Well, I think simply allowing Black folks' voice to not be drowned out. I feel like organizing in San Antonio alongside POC and white folk, a lot of the times they feel liberated, and oftentimes that ends up in them being louder than us on our own issues regarding police brutality. Not necessarily that police brutality only affects Black folk, but it substantially affects Black folk. So I will say that, really standing there in solidarity and really allowing Black folk to think for ourselves, to speak for ourselves, to feel for ourselves, and to allow our ancestors to guide us into the light of justice for our people. And that means not speaking over Black folk, not reinterpreting what Black folk clearly say. And that means giving them the mic, simply, and allowing them the space to allowing us to project the space for our voices to be heard.
Great. Camilla Factory, Dr. Hudspeth, and Dr. Gregory Hudspeth, and Araneta Pierce, I appreciate your time. And what I really hope is that this is just the beginning of this conversation, not an ending of this conversation. So I plan on calling on each and every one of you again to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
When we come back, we're going to hear from San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg. We're also going to hear from DA Joe Gonzalez, as well as San Antonio Police Chief William Mcmanus.
A discussion of race and police accountability now extending to some of our city leaders.
We shouldn't have to be teaching our kids that fear every time we leave the house, that basically we could be shot.
A call for reopening the cases of 2 Black men shot to death by San Antonio police officers was the focus of this peaceful demonstration.
I will never give up on fighting to get justice for my nephew.
There was no attempt by law enforcement to do any cover-up. They filed the case over here. The DA's office worked it up. They presented it to a grand jury.
The grand jury ruled in favor of police.
And it hurts them because This is happening here, but people aren't paying attention to that.
Until the systemic racism is solved, we're going to keep fighting.
How do we build a better relationship with police?
It should not be the union is protecting officers from the city leadership and from the people. It should be the union is protecting good cops from bad cops.
There are cases, and how in the world did the guy get his job back? Most of those cases, if you look at the details of them, it was because there was an error that was committed on the chief or the internal affairs.
Tonight, a conversation with our city leaders as San Antonio pushes for change.
I'm the mayor of this damn city, and we're gonna make change together, okay?
Welcome back to this town hall. Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll came out today with some interesting findings on COVID-19. But what we're talking about in this town hall is basically the intersection of race and policing and what the community would like to see happen. We are joined right now by San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg, along with Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez. Thank you both for being with us. We expect Chief William Mcmanus to join us before this conversation is over as well. We had a lot of people ask questions about the future and about what they would like to see. A point of contention in this poll, Mr. Mayor, along with people seem to support the police department, but they also supported police reform. There were also a lot of questions about the police union. And 60-some% believe that the police union protects bad officers. Your reaction to that?
Well, I think 67% of the community is keenly aware of what we know here at the city, which is that there are provisions within the collective bargaining agreement as well as within state statute that makes it very difficult to hold officers who are out of line accountable for their actions. And that has been demonstrated year after year as the chief of police within his executive authority has made personnel decisions that are in some cases overturned by arbitration panels that aren't getting the full view of disciplinary records. I think that has to change, and people want it to change, and that's part of our focus of reform efforts.
Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez also joining us as a part of this conversation. And Mr. Gonzalez, in the last hour, we talked to Camilla Factory. She's a local activist, and she specifically talked about the cases of Marquise Jones, Charles Roundtree, and Antonians Scott. You recently stated that you would not be reopening those cases. Can you tell us why not?
Sure. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to this forum. I think it's a very necessary forum, and I'm glad to be part of it. But what I want to get clear is that people have been using different verbs to describe what I have done and what I have not done with regard to those three cases. People have said that I have refused to review them. That's not true. I have reviewed all three of them on multiple occasions, including last week and even to some extent yesterday. I've continued to review them. The problem is we as lawyers have to follow the law, and the decisions that we make as prosecutors is to review cases and to decide whether or not a crime occurred. I have to look at these cases with an eye toward whether or not the officers were justified in taking the action that they did. In other words, were they justified in firing their weapon? Now, keep in mind that two of the three cases occurred before I even took office, before I even got here. But again, I have reviewed personally all three cases. What I have to decide is whether or not the officers had a reasonable belief that their actions were immediately necessary. And I've reviewed those cases, and I've come to the conclusion on more than one occasion that I believe that that the officers acted reasonably and their actions were immediately necessary. Now, that's not to say that I can't keep an open mind. I will keep an open mind if there's ever any evidence presented to me that would lead me to believe otherwise, but that hasn't happened yet. I have invited people out in the community, and I've heard Ms. Factory. I'm very impressed with her. She's a bright young lady. I am personally inviting her to come to my office. Let's sit down and talk about it. Give me an opportunity to explain to her why we have made those decisions, and maybe she'll come away with a better understanding. I'll tell you that in the last week, we've met with no less than 5 different members of the African American community, including an elected official who represented that area. And I believe that they came away with an understanding about why we have made those decisions. Again, nothing is set in stone. If somebody brings me some information, some piece of evidence that would lead me to believe that a grand jury would do something different, then I'm willing to listen to that. But that hasn't happened yet.
All right, Police Chief William Mcmanus is with us right now. Chief, thank you for being with us. We were pointing out in this poll that we've seen that a lot of people are supportive of the police, but they are also wanting police reform. And as a matter of fact, in the approval ratings, you were at 77% approval in this latest poll. Your reaction to that, is that kind of reflective of what you're hearing in the community? Oh, I think you're muted, Chief.
Hi, Steve.
There you go.
There we go.
So are you talking about what my reaction is to my approval rating?
No, I can imagine what your reaction is to your approval rating. I want to know what you think about, a lot of people would say they support the police, but they also support police reforms. Is that of two minds? I'm not necessarily sure I see it that way.
I don't think it's of two minds, Steve. I think that, what people have seen over the years that have happened based on acts of misconduct by police officers and the feeling or the belief or the perception that there is no justice. I understand that feeling. When it's seen, over and over and over again, when officers get their jobs back, when they should be fired, people become frustrated, as we do. And I think something needs to be done about that. And I've made it very, very clear that about my position on, the articles in the police contract that deal with discipline, and I think that they need to be changed.
And speaking of that, I want to get to some of the community questions that we had come into our website. This one comes from Eric. Eric asks, is there still a need for a police union? Speaking of, officers with disciplinary problems should not keep their jobs because of the union. Your thoughts on that, Chief?
But I am against articles in the collective bargaining agreement that give an unfair advantage to officers who engage in misconduct. And I can rattle off a list of them right now. So those need to go in order to make the process fair and in order to allow my decision to fire someone final.
Mr. Mayor, I want to talk to you because you have been part of a collective bargaining. You voted on a police union contract and a fire union contract. Do you feel like do you feel
I didn't get to vote on a fire union contract because that arbitration process was also summarily abused. It had to go to arbitration, not negotiation. And then on the police side, voted against the current one that we're talking about.
And my question is, do you think that some of your fellow council members who voted for the current contract are thinking differently now? Are you noticing that there's a change out there? Because I want to point out the last time it was you and Councilman Ray Saldana, if I'm not mistaken, who voted against the contract.
That's right, and I see clear consensus among the council to do the work of reform that the chief is outlining in terms of disciplinary reform. The contract is more than just discipline, and it's also finance and benefits. But in terms of disciplinary reform, there is virtual unanimity among us, and it's reflected in the community conversations that are happening and the demonstrations that are occurring, not just here in San Antonio, but across the country. People want this to change. They want accountability. And, in this case, provisions within the contract stand in the way of that.
Well, we were out in the community. So many of our questions were directed to you, Mr. Mayor, as well as you, Police Chief Mcmanus. I want to get to one right now, and this one comes from a woman by the name of Jacqueline Ali. Jacqueline is a local retired history teacher. She says in her career she's taught many of her students about the importance of understanding history, but that right now we are living it. We are in this special moment where we are living history. And here's her question for both the mayor and the police chief.
If I could ask the mayor or even the police chief, I have grandchildren, I have sons, and it's been a concern of mine about what's been going on and how safe in the future will my grandsons be. It's a scary thought after all that's gone on over the past few weeks, and to think as a parent and a grandmother that this could have been any of our children, and if my sons or grandchildren were to get stopped, how safe are they in looking at everything that's gone on in the past?
A very simple but profound question. How safe are they?
Mayor?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question and the place that it comes from. And I would say that, you know, the last 6 months of American life are changing fundamentally the direction of this country. And in my mind, it can be best described as a reconciliation. In terms of this pandemic, as well as what we've seen in the outpouring for systemic justice and an end to racism that is throughout our institutions, we have now seen, both within our economic and social structures of this country, just how inequitable and unjust it is for particular members of our communities of color, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans. And that's what this is all about. We have an opportunity now, rising from this pandemic and also coming off of an atrocious murder in Minneapolis, to create a system that's fair and more just for everyone. And I think that, you know, unless we stay laser focused on that, unless we stay laser focused on achieving that, we will have done this whole effort. We will not have taken advantage of the moment that we have to change things.
Chief, talk about the concerns for that mother and grandmother.
And a very, very just concern, I might add. So we are laser focused on our policies, our training, and we want to make sure that training and those policies guarantee as much as we possibly can that everybody's going to be safe. I mean, we've changed our policies years ago, where some departments are just now changing. For example, chokeholds, shooting at vehicles, just to name two. But we continue to focus very heavily on training, de-escalation, use of force policies, trying to make it as safe as we can for everyone out there. Between training, policies, good supervision, good leadership throughout the department, we hope to make it as safe as we can for everybody.
District,
and
go ahead.
And if I may jump on to that real quick, Steve, because this is not just about policing. You know, I was watching a movie yesterday, and there was a great quote in there. The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And this goes well beyond policing into how we invest in our communities to make sure that it doesn't matter who you are, what the color of your skin is, that we are building healthy communities at all parts of our community. And that's where this begins. And that's why I think this whole movement is about much more than simply reforming police departments.
Absolutely. I want to bring the district attorney in. Mr. Gonzalez, I want to talk to you about how you see your role in police reform. I know that you said you've been meeting with a lot of people and talking about this issue of race in policing. What do you see your role as in police reform, and what would you like to see happen?
Thank you, Steve. And I'm glad you asked that question, because right out of the chute, the question was about those specific cases. But I think we need to look at the bigger picture, and the bigger conversation, the bigger narrative is on reform. You know, what I've been saying, and it's no secret that the majority of my legal career I spent as a criminal defense lawyer. And I feel like, remember the old Barbara Mandrell song was country before country wasn't cool, or when country wasn't cool. I was speaking about criminal justice reform 20 years ago, and people now are grasping about what it's all about. And part of that we've been doing in the office is our version of police reform. Two major policy changes that we've implemented from the other administrations is, for example, we take every case involving a police-involved shooting to the grand jury. even those cases where we think there may be justification, even those cases where we think it's a close call, we want the citizens of Bexar County to make the final call. So that's one big difference. Another substantial difference was there used to be what was called in the past a clearance letter or a clearance report under both prior administrations, where they would submit a preliminary report and then the prosecutor would make a decision. Well, it looks like a justified shooting, so you can put him back on the street. We don't do that anymore. We wait until we get the entire file because we want to make absolutely sure we know what was involved in this case before we tell anybody that we think that it's safe for that officer to get back on the street. Another thing I've talked about is there are certain officers we've identified as having little to no credibility, and I think it's important for people to know who they are. And so that's another thing that we're trying to do is implement a policy of identifying those people, those officers that we believe are not doing a good job. And I support the chief's position that bad cops ought to stay fired. And so I do think the police unions, who by the way didn't contribute to my campaign, didn't endorse me, they are part of the problem that needs to be changed, because there is systemic racism in law enforcement. There is systemic in the criminal justice system, and the sooner we recognize it, the sooner we can do something about it.
You talked about the list of officers who are not deemed credible. Is that the so-called Brady list? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, it's called different things. I mean, the common term for it is a Brady list, but actually it's one entire list that is commonly referred to as a disclosure list. Within that list is something called a permanent list. That's really what I'm talking about. We again commonly refer to that as the perm list, where we would identify officers that we do believe have some credibility problems, and we're working on a policy to disclose that to the people that need to know. For example, law enforcement, and so that's something that we're engaging in ongoing discussions.
Bringing us back to the issue of reform and policy change, I want to get to a question from Dan Hardiman. When we first met Dan, he quoted Dr. Martin Luther King by saying, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." He went on to say that police need to start policing the police, and he's frustrated with the lack of changes he sees happening on a policy level. Here's his question.
Good people out there that's doing nothing at all, and that's why this stuff is constantly happening. It's going to continue to happen until people wake up and serve justice like justice is supposed to be served. Why haven't they made the moves to change what's going on? And they know what's going on. It's in the news every day.
Mr. Mayor, I'm going to let you answer that one first.
I think he's exactly right, which is why as we move through the process to reform, whether it's through contract negotiation, which are beginning to take shape, to policies that are done exclusively and immediately by the chief, or whether it's policy implementation by the council, we need the community to continue to have to put the pressure on their elected officials to get the job done and to be held accountable. And that's what we need in order for reform to take shape. You know, the march to reform and to justice is not something that we get to the finish line and it goes away. This is a constant effort. And in some cases, it has to grind away against, calcified bureaucracies. But that's what has to get done. And that's why I think it's so easy for us to lose momentum and lose focus. But we've got to stay on it and be held accountable to it by the public.
Chief, I want to ask you a question about what you would like to see, something that's outside of the police union contract. We've talked a lot about that. I know that you have been very active in the community policing that you've set up in the city of San Antonio, mental health, how you treat mental health cases in the city of San Antonio. I'm not sure you're getting enough credit for those things, but I want to mention those things. What is something else that you think needs to happen outside and separate from the police union contract?
Steve, if I can go back to the mayor's question about the gentleman had about things need to change. Well, there is a duty to report misconduct by another officer, by an officer who observes it, and that was done some time ago. The blue wall or the blue curtain, whatever we want to refer to it as, is not as strong today. Nearly as strong today as it was years ago because of the policy changes that a lot of departments have made. That is one that we made, I'm not sure how many years ago it was, but it wasn't recently. And I think, I don't know that as far as what would I like to see change. I think we need to continue doing things that we're doing in terms of community engagement. I think that right now we're being looked at as the budget season as the budget session approaches, as to what things do the police do that maybe we don't need to continue to do. And years ago, because we were always a 24/7 operation, we absorbed a lot of things that other agencies didn't absorb because we are 24/7. And I'll give you just an example of just a few. The mental health issue, and we have been nationally recognized for the work that we've done in the mental health arena. Homelessness, we do a lot with homelessness. There's a number of things that I think are going to change once the council gets we get through this council work session.
I want to ask you, Chief, since we have you on, a little bit about police brutality. That's something we've been hearing a lot about, especially when we look at the list of questions that our viewers sent in. Is that happening to some degree in your department?
Police brutality?
Yes.
When there are claims of excessive force, they are investigated, and they're investigated very, very thoroughly. They're investigated by internal affairs. In some cases, in many cases, the complaints are referred to the district attorney's office for review. They go through a complaint and administrative review board hearing, and then in that hearing, the board will vote to either sustain or not sustain the complaint. If it's sustained, they recommend corrective action to me. I have what they call a Loudermill hearing once before any discipline is imposed. The officer comes up with his attorney or her attorney. My attorney's there, the command staff is there, part of them. And we talk about it. We list any kind of mitigating circumstances that the officer may want to offer. And then we kind of go from there in terms of whatever kind of punishment or discipline is meted out. Understand that, and I very, very rarely hear this discussed when we talk about excessive force cases, whether it's deadly force or whether it's not deadly force. And that is the Graham versus Connor decision that was back in 1989 by Judge Rehnquist. And it lays out the foundation for police use of force. And I would suggest that anyone who is unfamiliar with that, I would friendly suggestion to go ahead and take a look at that, and it would give you a very clear understanding of how that use of force is judged by not only the police department but also by the DA's office.
Mr. Mayor, I want to ask you a question about the budget process since the chief brought it up. I mean, you hear a lot of this defund the police, which under my understanding is most of that is taking away some of the duties from the police departments that maybe they hadn't done in the past, that have been kind of put on their shoulders, like the chief just said. Do you think this is going to be a different budget process for the police department than we've seen in years past?
Yeah, I think it is because of for a lot of reasons. One, most notably, is the recovery effort that our city's underway with. But there's a lot of different interpretations about what people are saying with regard to defund the police. But what I think they all converge on is the idea that we as a community and we as cities across this country need to find a healthier balance in the way we invest in our communities in order to create healthy and safe neighborhoods and cities. And if our calculus is simply based on how much resource we give to police departments, then we've got it all wrong. We end up having to police the problems that we create when we disinvest in our communities. And when we have police budgets through union contracts or whatever, crowding out libraries and parks and streets and all the other services that create a healthy city, you're going to reap what you sow. And so when I hear defund the police, I hear we need to find balance so that we're investing in our communities and not ending up having to just police poverty. And that's what I think the council will be focused on. I think it starts with a dive into what exactly the police department does that isn't necessary police work, which makes their work more difficult, complex, and more dangerous, and also takes away resources from other things. So it's going to be an engaging discussion. I think there's going to have to be some long-term strategic goals, but it starts now.
Before we get to some closing thoughts, this is obviously a community listening session, if you will, and I know that the city has held a number of those. How have those been going, and can you speak to some of the key takeaways of those sessions?
Is that for me or
yes,
for the chief?
Both.
Oh, yeah, I mean, and you're talking about the listening sessions yes. for reform. It's very similar to the demonstrations that are taking place. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of concern and anger, frankly, for the lack of reform that hasn't been done yet. And so it's reinforcing the work that we're doing at the council and the work that the chief is doing to identify areas of improvement. And I don't think it's going to really ebb until we actually can show some of that progress. So it's been instructive. It's been reinforcing of what we're seeing in cities across the country.
I want to wrap this up by letting each of you kind of give us your final thoughts on race and policing. I want to start with District Attorney Joe Gonzalez. What do you want people at home who are watching this to take with them from this conversation from your perspective?
Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me into this conversation, this dialogue. I think it's a very important one that needed to be had. I want people to know in Bexar County that we're trying to do the right thing. We're not perfect. I'm not perfect, but it's a work in progress. We've been in office now a year and a half, and a year and a half we've identified 6 goals with regard to police reform. We have started 4 of the 6. The 2 that are left for us to continue to accomplish is the creation of the Citizens Advisory Committee. Those people that I mentioned earlier, 2 of them indicated an interest in being part of that committee. We're excited about that. The other thing is to improve our training of our prosecutors, because as I mentioned, there is racism, there's implicit bias, not just in law enforcement, but in prosecution, in criminal justice system in general, with judges, with lawyers, with everybody involved in that system. I want to do something to bring awareness to that. I want to do something to diminish that. And so those are the things that we're working on. But I would like people to understand that we're trying to work hard at what we do. It's not an easy job. It's not easy for us to second guess what happens when an officer has to pull his weapon and make the decision to fire upon an individual. That's a tough job. I get that. I'm up for it. But I want people to understand that we have to follow the law. We cannot make decisions based on emotion. We can't make decisions based on what happened in Minnesota and Atlanta. We have to make decisions on cases that happened here in Bexar County on a case-by-case basis. And all I ask is that the citizens of Bexar County give us an opportunity to do our job, because we are trying to do the right thing.
Chief Mcmanus, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, let me go back a few years to President Obama's 21st Century Report on policing, and there were 76 recommendations in 6 different areas in that report. We took that report and bumped all those recommendations up against the policies that we have in SAPD. As a matter of fact, we put 6 committees together to review each of the 6 areas, the recommendations in each of the 6 areas. And what we found was that we were in compliance with 73 of those 76 recommendations. What we also did when the Obama administration was in office, there were a number of consent decrees that were put on a number of police departments, and we took those consent decrees and we looked at the requirements that those consent decrees put on those cities, and all of those requirements that were put upon those police departments, we had met all of those policy recommendations, all of those policy requirements. And I believe that there were 3 or 4 of those consent decrees that we did that with. That is to say that we have good policies in the department. We continue to watch the horizon for things that go on in other cities around the country with police to make sure that our policies are tight and that we don't fall into the same situation that other cities have fallen in with their police departments when they get into trouble. So that is to say that we have good policies, we have a good police department, we have good officers, but that said, we need to continue to reform and continue to change with the times.
Thank you, Chief. Mr. Mayor, your final thoughts.
Yeah, well, this has been a great conversation, and I appreciate it, Steve. It's also very difficult, but let's be clear. Systemic racism and injustice has manifested itself in our criminal justice system, and we're seeing that play out all across the country. But that's not the only place it exists. And I think in order for us to create communities where people feel safe, where people feel equally treated, where there's equity, we have to focus in on how we create community, how we invest our resources publicly, so that communities of color no longer feel and no longer are treated unequally. And that is going to take unwinding history, years of history, generations of history in which people were treated lesser than one another. And so this goes beyond policing, but I think you're seeing a movement led in part by young people who are fed up of the kind of injustice they've seen their parents and peers undergo. And so I look forward to working with our community on these issues, and I'm excited about what America will look like when some of these reforms are put in place, not just in our city, but across the country.
Absolutely. San Antonio Mayor Ron Nirenberg, San Antonio Police Chief William Mcmanus, and Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez, thank you so much for your time and for your perspectives.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good night.
A couple of reminders before we go. We started this out by talking about the Bexar Facts-KSAT-Rivard Report Poll. We talk about COVID. We talk about police reform. We talk about race in our city. You can take that very same poll online right now at bearfacts.org. You can take the poll yourself. We want you to take the poll. We want to hear from you on your opinion. But the big thing in all of this, if you want to have your voice heard, vote.
Absolutely.
Early voting begins Monday, the 29th, next Monday for the runoff election. July 14th is Election Day, leading up to November. Again, I hope this is just the start of this conversation, not the end. Thank you for joining us.
Goodbye.